Well, we are in the middle at my house of teaching my 16-year-old how to drive. And teaching her how to drive is driving me crazy. And some of you parents have done this. You've got a teenager, they're very eager to learn how to drive, and so they're pushing and pushing and pushing so you can learn how to drive. And the little secret about that is that you too are actually really excited about them learning how to drive, because you are tired of carting them around everywhere. Like, I am so tired. I cannot count the number of nights I have sat in a Whataburger parking lot waiting for her to be done hanging out with her friends so we can go home. These are Saturday nights. She has no concept in her mind that I have to work tomorrow. And I am a good husband, so I don't make my wife go and do these late nights out in the middle of nowhere. And as much as I want her to learn how to drive so that I don't have to wait for theater rehearsal to be over at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, I never wanted to teach her how to drive. I tried to do everything to avoid teaching her how to drive. I said, well, why don't you just do one of those driver courses? You can do that. That would be great. But because her schedule's so busy, none of that really worked out, so it had to be parent taught. And so then I made the big mistake, is that I believed some of you. And here's what I believed. Many of you have come to us over the 7 years that our family has been a part of this community and said something that sounds like this: we love you and your girls so much. Let us know if there's ever anything we can do. And I believed you. And I said, great, teach this girl how to drive. And you all said no. No one said yes. And what shocked me wasn't that everybody said no. It's the reason everyone said no. Because when I asked people to teach Kate how to drive, you all said, well, I would like to keep a good relationship with her. And I thought, I would like to keep a good relationship with her. I remember what it was like to learn how to drive. My parents didn't teach me how to drive. My older brother taught me how to drive on back roads in Mississippi. But I remember when my mother taught my brother how to drive. And sitting in the back seat were this very pious woman who doesn't usually speak like this. Unfurled profanities I did not even know that she knew. And I thought, I needed a good relationship with my kid, not you. Nobody, no 30-year-old sits on the therapist's couch and complains about a broken relationship with a friend from church when they were 16. They complain about their parents. So my relationship with her, quite frankly, is more important than your relationship with her. So we were in this place where now we just have to teach her how to drive. And so Kate read the book. She went down and got her learner's permit, did all the things, learned all the rules, and we started slowly. First, it was just driving around our neighborhood. And when we felt like she had a good grasp of that, it was outside of our neighborhood. And right outside of our neighborhood is a freeway, but it's not a super fast freeway. It's not super dangerous. So she got up to driving around there. And then because she works in childcare at our West Side campus, we let her move up to the next stage where she could drive home from church, from the West Side campus to our house, but she would only go on the access roads, the feeder roads. And then she moved up to the freeway. And I remember what that's like. You're telling them everything because they don't know nothing. Use your turn signal. Slow down. Speed up. Four-way stop. Brake, 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 brake. But now, last night, she finished her last mandatory hours of driver training. They got this little app. She clocks all of her hours. Last night, she finished with her last night drive. But I noticed even before last night that there was a change, that we weren't yelling at her anymore. As a matter of fact, this last week, when she was driving to school, I'm riding shotgun, and I noticed that I'm hardly even paying attention to what she's doing. I'm actually just sitting returning some email on my phone. And every now and then, though, I have to remind her of all of the things that she already knows how to do. And what I'm trying to do is to lessen the number of tickets she will get in her life, really decrease the accidents that she'll have in her life, and trying to train her to be a good driver. And these are things that good drivers do. These are the things, honey, that you need to know, things that you need to do in order to be a good driver. And she's right in that little space now between still having a little bit of fear about driving and that typical 16-year-old irrational level of confidence. And so we have to stay on top of her to remind her not of what she doesn't know and hasn't learned, but what she already knows and's already learned. And so if you've been around Ecclesia for the last 4 weeks, you know that we have been in this series on the Bible and talking about what the Bible is and how to be a good reader and user of the Bible, what its purpose is. Because it is often this complicated text that people misinterpret, that some people use to wound and injure other people. And much of it is difficult to understand if you don't know the history and the context. And some people think you have to know a lot about old languages and able to understand the Bible. And so we wanted to give you all a good 30,000 level look at what the Bible is and how it works and how it functions, so that when you sit down on your personal Bible reading or in a small group, when you sit down with your family, when you hear someone teaching on the Bible, you have access to what God is trying to do in your life through the scriptures. And one of the places that can often be confusing is when you flip through the latter half of the Bible, latter half of the Old Testament, when you're done with Genesis and Exodus and all those stories that they taught you in VBS, or around here, kids camp, which is somehow not VBS. When you're past all of those stories, you get to these prophets. And some of those guys are very weird and do strange things, and you don't know what's going on or why they're doing it. Like there's one prophet named Ezekiel who builds a model of the city of Jerusalem and then lays next to it on his side for over a year. God tells another prophet, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and marry 2 unfaithful women and see how that works out. And you don't know what any of that means. It's so confusing. But prophets serve this special purpose in the scriptures. And I don't know what it is that you think of when you hear the word prophet. Most of the time when people hear the word prophet, they don't think about the prophets from the Bible. They actually think of prophecy. And this idea that there are people with special access or special knowledge about what's going to happen in the future somewhere. That you go to a prophet and they tell you, well, this is what's going to happen. This is what's, almost like going to a palm reader. But when you open up the scripture, that's not primarily what prophets do. And to understand prophets and what prophets do, it's helpful to know why they exist. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this covenant that God makes with Abram. And God tells Abram, I'm going to save the world through your family. You're going to have a child, even though you're very old, but that child is going to become a nation, and through that nation, someone is going to save all of creation. That's God's preferred future. But it takes a long time for that child to come along, and he finally does, and Pastor Chris talked to you about this last week. That son comes along, and his name is Isaac. And God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and immediately in the story of this nation that is supposed to come, there is a threat to the promise. But God sends a ram in the thicket, and Abraham and Isaac are spared. And that son does become a nation, and they go into slavery, and then they come out of slavery and spend 40 years wandering in the desert, and they finally have their land and a place, and early on in their story, they are governed, they are ruled by prophets and judges. There comes a time where prophets and judges aren't enough for them anymore. And the prophet who was serving at the time, Samuel, is very old. And this is how the scriptures tell us the story of Samuel's last days and what the people wanted. When Samuel was old, he named his sons judges of Israel to rule over the people and be their deliverers. His first son, Joel, and his second son, Abijah, were judges in Beersheba, but they were not like Samuel. They profited from dishonesty, took bribes, and fostered injustice. So the elders of Israel gathered and came to Ramah to tell Samuel, "You have grown old, Samuel, and your sons do not administer justice the way that you did. Before things worsen, appoint a king to rule us as other nations have." This request, appoint a king to rule over us, bothered Samuel. So he prayed to the Eternal One and received an answer. God says to Samuel, "Listen to what the people are asking you to do. It is not a rejection of you. It is a rejection of my rule over them. It is what they have always done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until today, rejecting me and serving other gods. Now they are just doing it to you. So listen to what they are asking you to do, but make it plain to them what they are asking for. Warn them about what will happen if a king is appointed to rule over them." So Samuel told the people who were asking for a king what the Eternal One said. Samuel tells them, "If a king rules over you, things will be different from now on. He will make your sons drive his chariots, be his horsemen, and go into battle ahead of his chariots. Your king will select commanders over 1,000 and commanders over 50. He will make some of you to plow his fields and collect his harvest. Some of you will be the blacksmiths forging his shields and swords for battle and outfitting his chariots. He will force your daughters to make perfumes, to cook his meals, and to bake his bread. He will seize the choicest of your fields, vineyards, and olive orchards to give to his courtiers, and 1/10 of your grain and your vineyards to give to his court eunuchs and servants. This king you ask for will take your slaves, male and female, and his own, and put the choicest of your donkeys and your young men to do his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks. You will essentially become his slaves. One day you will cry for mercy from the Eternal One to save you from this king you have chosen for yourselves. But be assured, he will not hear you on that day." And the people of Israel say to Samuel, "We have decided that we will have a king who will rule over us, so that we will be like all other nations and will have someone to judge us and to lead us into battle." After Samuel heard their demands, he told the Eternal One what they had said. And God says to Samuel, "Do as they have asked. Give them a king." So Samuel told the people of Israel to go back to their cities until he would call them together to anoint them a king. And what happens in the story of Israel is that slowly over time, everything that Samuel said would happen, happens. As a matter of fact, it's the only way that could happen, because all through history, and you know this already, all dictators and would-be dictators, all authoritarians and strongmen and wannabe authoritarians and strongmen, they will tell you that what they're interested in is for you, but they're only interested in things for themselves. It's all about themselves. And they will fool you into believing that you can follow them and they will lead you to peace and prosperity, that things will be better, that they're the only ones that can do it, and that's always been false. And so what happens in the story of Israel is that slowly the kings demand more and more and more. They make alliances with other nations. They begin to incorporate other gods, because with alliances to other nations comes the worship of other gods. And into this mix, into this scene, God raises up prophets. And the prophets come along, and they tell the people, you have left your God. And so most of the time, when we think about prophets, what we think about is someone who tells us about the future. And the prophets do that a little bit, but they spend most of their time telling us about the past, about what God has done, how God has been faithful, what the covenant looks like, and that we have been unfaithful. And that to fix the problem, whatever it is, the answer to that is returning to God. The prophet's job in the First Testament primarily is to call people back to God. So one of my favorite prophets is Isaiah. And I love the way that Isaiah captures his call to become a prophet. This is what Isaiah 6 says. It says, in the same year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a grand throne, way up high, with a flowing cape that filled the whole temple. Bright, flaming creatures waited on him. Each had 6 wings, 2 covering its face, 2 covering its feet, and 2 for flying. Like some fiery choir, they would call back and forth continually, holy, holy, holy is the Eternal, the commander of heavenly armies. The earth is filled with his glorious presence. They were so loud that the door frame shook and the holy house kept filling with smoke. And Isaiah says, I am in so much trouble, I am ruined. I'm just a human being, fallible and stammering. My lips are encrusted with filth, and I live among people just like me. But here I am, and I've seen with my very own eyes none other than the King, the Eternal, commander of heavenly armies. Then one of the flaming creatures flew to me, holding a red-hot ember, which it had taken from God's table, the temple altar, with a pair of tongs. The creature held it to my lips. The creature says to Isaiah, look, with the touch of this burning ember on your lips, your guilt is turned away. All your faults and wrongdoings are forgiven. Then I heard the Lord's voice. God asked, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here am I. Send me. And the rest of what Isaiah does, and God tells him to do, is call people back to God. He reminds the people of what they already know, what they've already experienced. He wants them to be good followers of God, like teaching a child to drive. You know this already. You just have to do what you know. You just have to take all of that God has already done and put it into practice. And so there are a few things that are key to what prophets do in the Old Testament. And this isn't everything that prophets do, but is universal to almost all of them. And when we see in Isaiah's calling is that prophets are sent with a kingdom vision. That this is about what God is doing in the world. That God has invited Abraham's family into a covenant relationship, and this covenant relationship will prove to produce someone who will save the world. It is about all of the world. And one of the places that we need to hear prophets is that your life and my life should not be centered on what's good for us, what's good for our family, what's good for our kids, but what's good for the kingdom. What God is doing in the entire world. I had this experience of this last week when I was sacrificially serving the Lord in Malibu, California. This is a picture of me just hanging out in my hotel room. I was there for 3 days, training young preachers about preaching, and somebody has to do it. But on my way there, I get a call from my father while I'm driving from LAX to the campus at Pepperdine University. And he asked me what I'm doing. I said, well, I'm on my way. I'm in California right now. I'm headed over to Pepperdine to do some stuff. And he says, you're going to Malibu in the middle of the week? And I was like, yeah. And he says, your church must really love you. And I said, well, I don't know about that. But what we do share is an agreement that we all have gifts that are for the kingdom. And that to use those well, to be a follower of Jesus, is to orient your life about what God in his kingdom invites you to do. Because I remember well, 10 years ago, when I got a phone call on a Tuesday night from Pastor Chris, and he was telling me that we were adding campuses. They really wanted me to come down here and serve as teaching pastor here. And I told him, I really like the church where I am. And he told me in that phone call, I think that they will understand that this is about the kingdom. Now, I don't know if he believed any of that, but it worked on me at the moment. The prophets remind us that our lives are about the kingdom. And prophets also come to speak into a silencing culture. Every prophet in the scripture served under domination. Either domination of a Jewish king or in exile, sometimes under the domination of other priests and prophets in the religious system. None of them had carte blanche to say anything that they said, and yet they said it. Prophets like Nathan walked into the king and called him a sinner and a liar for what he had done. Every prophet speaks into a culture that would rather have them say nothing. And you already know this, that people hate you saying something when you really ought to say something. Because prophets talk about the thing that we don't want to talk about anymore. Prophets talk about sin. And nobody wants to talk about sin unless it's someone else's sin. And Isaiah's in the throne room, and the first thing that he realizes when he comes into contact with God isn't that the world is sinful or that Israel is sinful. What Isaiah realizes is that he is sinful. And that's hard to say in our world, because some of you have had conversations with family members and friends who are in bad spots making really poor decisions, and you know what they said back to you? Why don't you support me? And the answer is, I do support you. I'm supporting you not making a stupid decision. But in our world, that gets you nowhere, because everyone wants to be soothed, not saved. And the prophets remind us this is the way that we are saved. Isaiah is not first concerned that the rest of the world gets their act together. His first concern is that he gets his act together, and only when he does that does he have a place to stand. And then the prophets call for justice. In my office at home, I have a very thick book, and it's the writings and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., because I'm that kind of cool guy who loves to sit around and read sermons. And I've read a lot of those sermons, if not all of those sermons, and I don't know if Martin Luther King ever preached a text that wasn't from the prophets. And so those of you who are students of history will remember the I Have a Dream speech he gave, which wasn't the first time that he'd given that speech, but in it he says this line, "Let justice roll down like rivers and righteousness like a mighty flowing stream." That's from Amos. That behind every essential call for justice are the prophets. That the world can be better. And the reason that the world isn't better is because you're not better. And when you get better, the world will get better. And one of the most famous scriptures from the Old Testament that most of you know is from a prophet. It's in Micah 6:8, where he says, He has told you, mortals, what is good in his sight. What else does the Eternal ask of you but to live justly and to love kindness and to walk with your true God in all humility? So the prophets are sent into the world with a kingdom vision to speak into a silencing culture and to call for justice. And here's the thing about all of that. Everything that the prophets do is available to you. That prophets are in a special class of people with special knowledge that you don't have access to, called and invited to do a special thing. This is why the Apostle Paul later comes along and talks to people like you and me who have decided to follow Jesus and calls us a priesthood of all believers. The prophets just aren't talking about something that's going to happen in the future. The prophets are talking about what you can do with your life. And they do talk about the future a little bit. Because as they look back to remind Israel of all the things that they already know, they look forward and say, there is one coming, a child of this covenant promise who will save the world, and he will be the perfect prophet, priest, and king. Ecclesia, let me pray for you. God, we celebrate the Messiah who shows us what wholeness is, and we honor the prophets who remind us of how you have created us, how you have designed us to live, how to treat one another, and how to love well in a world that is antagonistic to goodness. And so, God, we would pray that you continue to empower us, that you would give us a vision for who you are inviting us to be. And we ask it in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.